Well, good afternoon, Maverick traders. Joe with you here. It's currency recap time. It's the 5th of June. It's Thursday. Let's get into the markets. You guys know how this works. I'm going to talk about some stuff and just make sure you take responsibility for it. What I will be talking about is the news of the day. We'll see if we can break these markets down technically. And actually, I do have a couple of trades to look at. So I'll share them with you.
All trades and analysis in this video are intended for professional traders only. This content does not constitute financial advice and is for educational purposes. This video is being released after a short delay due to Compliance Department review. Maverick members receive this content immediately as part of their daily trading resources. If you're ready to level up, consider joining Maverick Currencies. Our traders trade firm capital and keep 70 to 80% of profits. You bring the skill, we provide the backing. Let's get into today's market recap and see how the pros are trading the currency markets.
Moving into the market analysis, it was just kind of another day that was sideways, at least in the U.S. markets. It did carry over into the currencies. So the U.S. markets closed lower today. I'm seeing a little bit more weakening economic numbers, and I do think that's kind of building into a plateau up at where this level is. The markets are still, at least U.S. side markets, equity markets are still in a pretty good uptrend, a very nice high base, showing a lot of strength, but there's a little bit of worry, a little bit of pushback when it comes to some of these numbers that are showing a little bit more soft. Now, on the other side of the coin, we did have the Qs drop the lowest of the three, I should say, NASDAQ, and it was pretty much entirely based on Tesla. Big part of that loss. A lot of political ploy when it comes to that. If you guys want to try to sort through that mess, be my guest, but it is definitely impactful, and I really believe that was the majority of why it slid. However, it's still itself, overall, the NASDAQ in a nice bullish area. So let's get to the currencies. So the yen dropped pretty substantial. Now, I was digging around in the news. I do see that the Bank of Japan was pretty comfortable on staying pretty aggressive, worried about some tariffs and things like that. However, it was a pretty good drop, but when we look at the chart, it's kind of within a range. I would expect the US dollar to follow suit, and it didn't. It just stayed flat, franc down. Everything was very much flat. It almost looked like, hey, this could be kind of a risk on, because the Aussie and the Kiwi actually niched up a little bit with that drop in the yen, but the US dollar didn't follow it. Now, the other thing that caught me was crypto. Let's move on here. Crypto down substantially. So a big move to the downside in crypto. Gold dropped. Oil actually had a pretty good little bounce to the upside, about $1. So I would expect crypto to be kind of up if things were moving to a risk-on scenario, but the movement in the majority of these things kind of got things, for me at least, a little bit confusing. Everything really wasn't in line with a risk-on, risk-off move. It was kind of all over the place. Let's keep going here. Let's take a look at what the cryptos did. Now, the cryptos substantially the lowest. They had a very massive move to the downside. We'll get there in a second. So overall, I'm not changing anything. I mean, if you guys take a look at this chart, I'm going to keep it at a +2. Let's get there. And even with this move to the downside, and also, folks, I know this is the S&P. However, the Qs is very similar. It didn't really collapse. It's not like we had any sort of break below some massive support levels. In fact, we're just kind of right here at these highs, still within that ascending triangle range. Let me get that pen out here. I mean, so it's still there. I mean, we could go another day and a half down, hit that 20-day, and this is still a very, very strong chart nonetheless. So it is reactionary. I really think that is. I think a lot of the stuff is kind of leaning on news, which could be short-lived, but it's a little bit annoying, for lack of a better term. So let's take a look at things economically. This is kind of where I did see a little bit of that chink in the armor, a very good recovery in the U.S. markets. However, we're starting to see some misses here. That ADP non-farm roll wasn't a slight miss. It was a pretty good one. ISM Services PMI, a little bit of a drop there. I'm just going to pick on the U.S. here for a minute. So we've got the unemployment claims. It was an uptick. The expectations were for less. And so it's showing a little bit of, okay, we might be seeing some slowing. I really think that this U.S. non-farm payroll tomorrow is going to be really overdone. And what I mean by that, I truly think there's going to be a lot of eyes on it, and we might see a reaction. And the reason why I'm saying that, the unemployment rate might also follow as well, is because once you're up at the top, the markets don't like to be at a top or a bottom. They want to be moving higher or moving lower. So when you get consolidation, it creates nervousness. It creates what we refer to it as it creates power. The tighter something ranges, the longer it goes. You've got this very powerful expectations of good or bad, and the reaction can be pretty aggressive. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was a good or bad number if we saw the markets kind of move out of that range, up or down. Now, not saying forever, but it definitely could carry with it at least some volatility for you guys just to be aware of tomorrow. So let's take a look at the currencies. Let's see what they did as far as velocity wise. First off, let's start with the yen. Now remember, folks, this was the biggest loser of the day, but if you take a look at the chart itself, it just kind of rolled over. It rolled over strong after a pretty decent bounce over the last day and a half. So it's within range. It's not like it's gaining or losing any sort of ground that's going to make me really throw it all the way to a -2, -3. In fact, I moved it to a -1 from a 0. And the only reason is because I've got the RSI below that 50. It is ticking up. This last little candle wasn't here when I was building the class, but this is kind of a sideways moving average, flip-flopping SARS. So a 0, but since the RSI is slightly above the 50, or slightly, below the 50, I decided to give it a -1. But it's really not going anywhere. You can see it's still above this pivot point that it's set back here towards the end of May. So I gave it a -1 on velocity just for this, but it's still overall kind of a sideways trade. So let's go ahead and just move into the US dollar. Now the US dollar actually, to me, is weaker. And the reason being is because we have this slope, we have this movement moving down, a consolidation. Remember the yen, folks, that it moved higher. This did not. This flattened. And it would be expected, seeing a little bit of weakness or worries. The markets might be showing a top, stuff like that. The RSI is sideways below 50. So it was very easy for me to put this at a -2. Now, you could argue -1 if it was rallying, but it's not. So I'm really looking to see if this US dollar is in fact finally going to break a support level and move lower. Now, we've seen this many, many times, folks, that it just when it thinks it's going to, it just doesn't, does it? It comes right back. So the volatility in these currency markets are very difficult, but it's definitely sitting on my radar when it comes to the bear side. I got it at a -2 for today. Let's jump to the franc. The franc is showing more consolidation, a little bit of weakness, a little bit of anemic move to the upside over the last day or so. The RSI is still below the 50, but I do like how it's trying to work its way back. So I kind of gave it this, I'll give it a 0 on it. And that's where I kind of kept the franc. I think the big thing for me personally, folks, is the fact that it's sitting on this shelf here. This is kind of that support level, that make or break, but it seems to be comfortable retesting this. And that's fine. If it can move back, flip that SAR, I'm going to keep it at a 0. You could see that although the RSI is below that 50, it just didn't fall apart. It just kind of hit this 40 and it's kind of moving sideways. So it's not like it's the strongest or anything, but it's not as tumultuous as some of the others. Moving over to the euro. The euro, in my book, is starting to show more strength than the pound. A little bit of a move to the upside today. I'm not sure if that was just circumstance, meaning that, hey, nobody wanted to sell it, but it's still showing a little bit of kind of a consolidation, but glass half full. And I gave it that due to the RSI poking its head up and then staying flat. So if this can stay up here, if we could see this price action stay above this range, at least above that moving average, even though the moving average is kind of flat, the SAR did flip, but if I'd like it to stay above that 50 on the RSI. I'll keep that definitely comfortably at a +1. Moving to the pound, which they're usually supposed to be similar, but this is actually showing a little bit more weakness. I actually had to drop this from a +1 to a 0, and I didn't like the fact that the RSI just did not want to stay above that 50 for very long. We do have consolidation. It's called a symmetrical triangle for you guys that like to nerd out on charts. So it is tightening, and I do like how that moving average is trying to flatten itself out. I want to see the RSI show a little bit more strength, and this could happen hard and fast. This could consolidate and break up or down pretty quickly. So I could see the pound, I've got it here at a 0. I could see this easily being a +1, +2, or a -1, -2 within the next few days. That's just kind of how symmetrical triangles work. Now, it might take more than a few days to consolidate, but when they pop, they pop. So I'm just going to keep an eye on that one. I'm going to step to the side, though, when it comes to anything I want to pair with. Moving on to the CAD. The CAD did show some nice strength. I did like how it decided to move a little bit off of this base. This base here had been retested a few times. You guys can see that. But if it can keep itself up here, a little lower, that's fine. I just kind of want it away from this line and show that it can consolidate a little higher. Now, folks, it's not above the high, so it's not an ascending triangle yet, but it's more of a sideways trade. You can see that this RSI is trying to stay above that 50. Flip-flop SAR, but if it can stay kind of based here and maybe start to threaten this upside, I'd be pretty, well, I'd say I'd be a little bit more optimistic on the CAD. I have it at a +1 just because it is above the majority of that. Let's get to our risk on the Aussie. I like how this is starting to turn around, this moving average. I like the RSI staying above this 50, but it's still reluctant. I didn't want to go too strong, so I kept it as a +1. I was thinking, well, no, I was thinking we could do more than that, but I think what kept me from a +2 is it kind of failed at this first test. But that doesn't matter, because if it can turn at any point between this moving average and where it's at now and push above that, this is going to be a really nice, comfortable +2 breakout. If this continues higher, this would be a fun currency to pair against something weaker. So keep your eye on the Kiwi there. I'm sorry, folks, I mean the Aussie dollar. With that being said, let's take a look at the Kiwi. The Kiwi is similar, but the retracement's a little bit more aggressive. At least that's what I saw. I like the RSI consolidating above the 50. The flip-flop SAR is fine, but we do have a slight slope in this moving average. The Kiwi's been showing some pretty consistent moves to the upside, but it's these corrective actions you guys can see here, even here. Boy, when it corrects really aggressively. As long as it can adhere to this line that I drew in the first place, it's something that we can keep on the bull side to pair against some of the weaker. I just don't like how hard it corrects, and it can really mess with the trade sometimes. So it's tough to favor which one, the Aussie or this one, the Kiwi, moving forward. Right now, there's just really not much out there. And I'm going to show you an example of that here in just 1 second. But before we do so, let's take a look at our cryptos. So this is Bitcoin. There you go. So sideways, looking weak. Boom. I mean, I don't know what else to do with this. Bitcoin was a -2. Why? Well, a huge drop in the RSI. A big drop below 1, 2, 3 support levels. Flip-flop in the SAR. Now, the only thing that's saving this is its moving average, and the reason being is it hasn't caught up yet. So it's a -2. That could switch tomorrow. We know how these work. Take a look at Bitcoin Cash. Same idea, -2. The RSI, or excuse me, the moving average hasn't flipped fast enough. Everything else has. Look at that drop in the relative strength index, breaking support levels. Folks, it's difficult. I know that these things are probably speculative. I'm sure they're tied to things politically. You see some sort of mess when it comes to Tesla and blah, 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 and they react as such. So I do think that it's a little bit more of a speculative currency than some of the others. Let's take a look at Ethereum. It did the same. I decided to give Ethereum, actually both Ethereum and Litecoin, a little less. It's because it rolled all the way over. It did break the support level, and it does look like it's going to fall. You could give it a -2, but we'll see where this ends. If it could turn back and retest, we'll see. And here is Litecoin doing the exact same thing. So big movement in basically cryptocurrencies. Other than that, I really didn't see too much in anything else. So probably political, probably news-driven. The markets, at least on the U.S. side, are consolidating, trying to figure stuff out. But these are definitely still very, very, very reactionary. So this is where I sit on today's action. Just moved some of the cryptos from +1, +2, all the way down to -2, -1. But everything else is kind of sitting in the middle here. The U.S. dollar slid a little bit. I'm going to keep it where it's at. I don't really want to attack it too much because it's within its range. The yen, however, it did have some momentum, but it's still within its range. So I figured, okay, well, why don't I just go ahead and take a look at the strongest and the weakest and see if there's any possible trades. Let's take a look at a couple I looked at. So the first one would be the Aussie yen. Just taking a look at one of the strongest versus the yen being the weakest. See enough if I can play this to the upside. And yeah, even though it did break above that previous swing here, setting a higher low, it's, I like to see something breaking a little higher. It doesn't mean that it can't. It's just a little reluctant here. So it's nothing that I'm really for me, it's not worth throwing the dollars at. So I'm like, all right, well, let's take a look at another risk on versus the yen, and that's the Kiwi yen. So there's really nothing there floating my boat when it comes to what was the strongest versus the weakest in one day. So I decided to go a little bit further out. I like to look at some stability currencies, and I know just that with the drop in the yen compared to something has to have some sort of divergence. And so I decided, well, let me go ahead and check the euro yen. So when we jump over to that, you can see, okay, now we've got something. Now it's interesting because it wasn't the strongest versus the weakest. What it was the weakest versus something stable. I've seen this quite a bit. And you're not going to get sustainable moves off of this. However, it is a much better read. It's already above its resistance level. I like how the RSI has moved higher. The moving average is flat, but it looks like it could push higher. So if we get stability, or I should say continued weakness, or sideways even in the end, but the euro stays sideways to slightly up, this might be a potential trade. So out of them all, I really didn't do the strongest and the weakest. What I did is I did the weakest for today against something a little bit more stable. That can absolutely change, and I think that's the biggest problem that I've had over the last little bit is these things can change back and forth very quickly. So that's what I got for today, folks. Crypto shows some reactive volatility today. I truly believe a lot of that was probably reactionary based on some sort of events and news. I know that crypto is tied to a whole lot of speculative changes when it comes to things politically. We've got all sorts of fun tariff stuffs, but the U.S. has got its own problems. So keep an eye on that. Currencies consolidation, it just continues. I'm not seeing anything outside of anything normal. I mean, the yen, I saw it was down so much today, 0.75%, and I was excited to see it break apart and fall apart. But I got to the velocity score on it. It was just actually retesting a support level. It was a big move, but it's still within its range. So just make sure we double check those. Play relative strength and proper position sizing as always, folks. You guys don't have to trade if you're not comfortable with it, but it's been a fun one. Thanks for joining me, guys. We'll talk to you next time. Bye, everybody.